In this section, we will explore the structures belonging to the central nervous system. Recall that the central nervous system consists of two structures, the brain and the spinal cord. We'll begin by examining some selected structures of the brain. So the human brain is probably one of the more familiar anatomical structures. In the average adult, it weighs about 3.3 pounds and is roughly the size of two fists put together side by side. The outer surfaces of the brain are elaborately folded and take on a wrinkled appearance. And this is because during development, the brain is growing more rapidly than the membranous, fibrous connective tissue that will become the skull bones. Therefore, the brain folds in order to occupy the available space. The folding is also important because it gives the brain a larger surface area, which means that there are a greater number of neurons that can occupy the brain space, and a greater number of connections between those neurons can be made. So indeed, if the brain does not fold during development, such as what happens with an extremely rare condition called agyria, we know that major mental disability can occur as a result of that. And this is because smooth brains are not able to have as many connections, as well as far fewer neurons, than the brains that fold and develop normally. So we want our brains to be wrinkled in appearance and not smooth. The four major brain regions are the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So we'll begin by examining the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest and the most conspicuous region of the human brain. It forms the superior aspect of our brains, and it makes up an impressive 83% of brain mass. So it is by far the majority of brain tissue. We'll see later that the cerebrum is divided anatomically into lobes that are referred to as the cerebral lobes. The cerebral lobes each perform a variety of functions, but overall the cerebrum is typically referred to as the executive suite. And this is because the cerebrum gives us awareness of ourselves, as well as awareness of our sensations and perceptions. It gives us our ability to speak and communicate, as well as to remember and understand. And there are also specific neurons within the cerebrum that function to control the skeletal muscles. The elevated ridges of cerebral tissue are called gyri. Meanwhile, the shallow grooves that are found between those gyri are called sulci. There's also a superficial and deep organization to the cerebrum. Superficially, there is a thin layer of gray matter that is called the cerebral cortex, while the deeper material is white in color and is referred to as the white matter. The cortex consists of billions of neuron cell bodies, the dendrites that are associated with those cell bodies, as well as neuroglial cells and the blood vessels that are associated with those tissues. The deep white matter is mainly composed of very heavily myelinated neuron axons that function to connect the different regions of the cerebral cortex to one another, so that way the different regions of the cerebral cortex can communicate with one another. But they also function to connect the cerebrum to other brain structures, as well as other structures in the body. The cortex is where the cerebral processing occurs. So it is the cortex that gives us the awareness of ourselves and our environment and our sensations, as we talked about earlier, and allows us to communicate, remember, and understand, as well as interpret the sensory information that is coming into our brain. And it also initiates skeletal muscle movements as well. The first four lobes of the cerebrum are superficial, and they are seen here. So they are named specifically for the cranial bones that are found superficial to these lobes. We'll first begin by examining the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe functions to control all voluntary motor functions, which means that it controls all skeletal muscle movement. It's also involved in learning, working memory for tasks, as well as task management and planning, as well as judgment, reasoning, and personality. Our next lobe is the parietal lobe, which contains the regions that are involved with somatic or body sensations. So these are sensations such as touch, temperature, stretch, and pressure from things like the skin, the skeletal muscles, the joints, the tendons, and the ligaments. Next, we have the temporal lobe, which contains regions that interpret sound, which is also known as auditory information, as well as smell or olfactory information. Interestingly, the olfactory interpretation area is located within a region of the temporal lobe that is called the limbic system, which is largely responsible for processing emotions as well as long-term memories. This explains why certain odors and smells can evoke emotional responses or also trigger memories. No other sensation is interpreted in the limbic system, which is why the other sensations are not as largely responsible for triggering emotions or memories behind those particular senses. Next, we have the occipital lobe, which contains regions that function in the interpretation of visual information from the eyes. There's also a fifth lobe that is deep within the cerebrum that's called the insula or the insular lobe. It is found deep to the junction between the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. The insula functions to interpret taste, which is also known as gustatory information, from the mouth, the throat, and the tongue. So now that we have finished examining the cerebrum, we can turn our attention to the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is a region that forms essentially the inner core of the brain, and it's almost completely surrounded by the cerebrum. The diencephalon consists of three paired structures. The first is the thalamus, which makes up the superior aspect of the diencephalon. Next is the hypothalamus, which is located anteriorly and inferiorly to the thalamus. And then we also have the epithalamus, which is located posteriorly and inferiorly to the thalamus. So when I say these structures are paired, this means that there is a left and a right half to each of these structures. The thalamus is often referred to as the gateway to the cerebrum because the thalamus acts to relay most sensory information that is coming from the body's sense organs and sensory receptors to the different places in the cerebral cortex where those senses are interpreted. The only sensory information that is not relayed through the thalamus is the olfactory information that is coming from the nose. So recall that the sense of smell is interpreted within the limbic system. So within the thalamus, information is not simply sent to other parts of the brain, but it's also sorted out and edited, which means that the thalamus is involved with some information processing as well as filtering before that information is sent to its appropriate place in the cerebrum for interpretation. Next, we have the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is primarily a collection of nuclei. So that is, these are clusters of neuron cell bodies that each perform a different function. And primarily the hypothalamus functions to control homeostasis. So it's in charge of controlling all of the autonomic nervous system. So that is the division of the nervous system that controls cardiac muscle, all of the smooth muscles, as well as the glands. The hypothalamus also regulates body temperature, as well as food and water intake, as well as the physical responses to emotions. The hypothalamus also functions to regulate sleep and wake cycles because there is a nucleus, that is, there is a cluster of neurons within the hypothalamus that act as our 24-hour clock, which sets our daily rhythms. And it just so happens to be that one of these rhythms is our sleep cycle. The hypothalamus is also responsible for controlling endocrine function because the hypothalamus regulates the function of the anterior pituitary gland as well as the hormones that the anterior pituitary releases. The final structure of the diencephalon is called the epithalamus, and it's located at the posterior side of the diencephalon. The major structure to note within the epithalamus is a small gland that's called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is the site of production for a hormone called melatonin. So this graph shows the release of melatonin throughout the day from the pineal gland. So on the vertical axis here we have melatonin concentration, noting that the larger the number corresponds to the higher the concentration that's being released into the bloodstream. And then on the horizontal axis we have the time of day. And we notice that the release of melatonin is not consistent throughout the day. So rather, significantly more melatonin release occurs in the evening, that's when the sun begins to set, and also when it is dark out. The levels of melatonin in our blood peak in the early morning hours just before sunrise, and the hormone actually almost nearly vanishes from the blood at sunrise. So because of this very time-dependent release, melatonin is often referred to as the hormone of darkness because it's typically released in high quantities at night. It is the hormone that's responsible for causing drowsiness at night, and it also helps to serve to regulate our sleep-wake cycles in conjunction with the hypothalamus. So next we have the brainstem, and the brainstem is the brain structure that's going to join the brain to the spinal cord at the base of the brain. So the brainstem as a whole contains centers for autonomic nervous system functions, so it does have some overlap with the functions of the hypothalamus. It contains the pathways for tracts, so that it's neuron axons, that extend between the higher levels of the brain, like the thalamus, the cerebrum, or even the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. So essentially the brainstem is serving to connect the spinal cord to all of the other regions of the brain. The brainstem also contains the majority of the cranial nerves, which are part of the peripheral nervous system. Of the 12 cranial nerves that emerge from the brain, 10 of these 12 nerves are associated with the brainstem. So like the diencephalon, the brainstem also contains 3 major regions. The superiormost part of the brainstem is called the midbrain. The anterior part of the brainstem is a mound-shaped region that's called the pons. And the inferior aspect of the brainstem is called the medulla oblongata, or also just simply the medulla. The midbrain has structures in the corpora quadrigemina, which send auditory information to the cerebrum for the conscious perception of sound. And it also contains structures that control visual reflexes in order to quickly orient the eyes toward a sound or towards an object in the space around us. Next we have the pons, and the pons is a Latin word that means bridge, and it functions as the main connection between the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, and so in that way it does very appropriately fulfill the functions of its name in that it serves as a bridge between these brain structures. Finally, we have the medulla oblongata, which contains many bundles of axons that extend between the brain and the spinal cord. And it also controls autonomic nervous system functions because the autonomic commands that come from the hypothalamus are communicated to the rest of the body through the medulla oblongata. So it's the hypothalamus that's actually issuing those commands, and the medulla oblongata is simply communicating those commands to the rest of the body to carry out the body's response to those. So last but not least, we have the posterior and inferior aspect of the brain, which contains a structure called the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is the final brain structure we'll examine. The cerebellum resembles a small version of the cerebrum because it is also very elaborately folded with gyri and sulci. And the name cerebellum actually reflects this fact too, because it resembles a smaller version of the cerebrum. The word cerebellum actually means little brain. So functionally, the cerebellum receives input from the parts of the cerebrum that control skeletal muscle movement, so that is from the frontal lobe. And it also receives input from the sensory receptors in the joints, the tendons, the ligaments, and the skeletal muscles. So using all of this information, the cerebellum helps to coordinate skeletal muscle movement so that movements are smooth and controlled. So external to the brain and the spinal cord, forming a tough connective tissue covering that surround and protect these central nervous system structures, are what are called the meninges. And the meninges function to protect the brain and the spinal cord, but they also protect the blood vessels that serve the central nervous system. And they also form pockets in order to contain the cerebrospinal fluid that supports the central nervous system tissue. So from external to internal, the meninges consist of the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is a thick, tough, and leathery covering that forms the superficial-most layers of the meninges. And its name actually means the tough mother because of its very tough characteristics, or its very tough strength. So I say layers with the dura mater because there are actually two layers to the dura mater. We have the periosteal layer of the dura mater and the meningeal layer of the dura mater. The periosteal dura mater attaches to the inner surfaces of the skull, but in general, the two layers, the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer of the dura mater, are fused together into one. Below this is the arachnoid mater, which contains a space called the subarachnoid space that helps to hold and contain the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid is found in the subarachnoid space between the surface of the brain and the arachnoid mater. And finally, we have a very delicate layer that is called the pia mater, which forms a thin, transparent covering on the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. And the pia mater functions to anchor the blood vessels to the surfaces of the brain and the spinal cord.